Joseph Désiré Mobutu was born on October 14, 1930, in Lisala, a remote town located along the Might Congo River in the Belgian Congo, what is known as modern-day Democratic Republic of Congo. The town, like much of the Congo at the time, was deeply entrenched in the oppressive colonial rule of Belgium, where Africans were treated as second-class citizens in their own land. Mobutu's father, Albert Bongo, was a cook for Belgian colonial administrators, a modest job that barely allowed the family to scrape by. His father's role in a European household gave young Mobutu an early view of how colonial structures operated and how Europeans wielded immense power and privileges. However, tragedy struck when Mobutu was just 8 years old. His father lost his life, leaving the family struggling to survive. The loss deeply affected Mobutu, who was now raised by his mother, Marie Madeleine Yemo, a resourceful and resilient woman who became the cornerstone of Mobutu's upbringing. Marie Madeleine worked tirelessly to support her children, doing small jobs like trading food and textiles in local markets. Despite the hardships, she taught Mobutu valuable lessons about perseverance and survival in an unforgiving world. Mobutu admired his mother's strength and determination, traits he would carry with him throughout his life. His childhood in Lisala was marked by the stark of inequality of colonial rule. While Europeans lived in comfortable homes and enjoyed luxuries, Congolese families like Mobutu's often lived in poverty with limited access to education and healthcare. Even at a young age, Mobutu understood that the world was unfair, and this realization sparked a determination to rise above his circumstances. Education and early career. Mobutu's education began in Catholic missionary schools, where discipline was severe and education was heavily Europeanized. Catholic priests and Belgian administrators controlled the curriculum, teaching French, mathematics, and religious studies while often discouraging traditional African languages and culture. Mobutu, however, excelled in his studies, displaying a sharp intellect and a natural gift for languages. He became fluent in French, the language of the elite, and developed a reputation as a clever and ambitious student. However, he also earned a reputation for his mischief and defiance, often testing the patience of his teachers. His rebellious nature earned him punishments, such as floggings, but it also revealed his burgeoning independence and unwillingness to conform to authority. At the age of 19, Mobutu was sent to Lulwaborg, modern-day Kananga, where he attended a military training school run by the Belgian colonial administration. This was a turning point in Mobutu's life, as the military provided him with a structured environment, discipline, and a pathway to personal growth. In the army, Mobutu trained as a non-commissioned officer and quickly stood out among his peers. His sharp wit, natural leadership qualities, and ability to navigate complex social dynamics earned him favor among his Belgian superiors, who saw him as a reliable African soldier. While many Congolese soldiers struggled under the colonial administration, Mobutu thrived, viewing the military as a stepping stone to greater opportunities. After completing his military training, Mobutu transitioned into journalism, an uncommon career for a young Congolese man at the time. He began writing for local newspapers, where his eloquent writing and political acumen gained recognition. Journalism introduced Mobutu to the nationalist movements sweeping across Africa in the 1950s. He became increasingly involved in political discussions and connected with prominent Congolese leaders, including Patrice Lumumba, a charismatic and fiery nationalist advocating for Congo's independence. Lumumba saw potential in Mobutu, who was articulate, ambitious, and deeply aware of the injustices of colonialism. By aligning himself with Lumumba and other independence activists, Mobutu began laying the groundwork for his own rise to power. Rise to power. Congo gained independence from Belgium on June 30, 1960, in a moment of great celebration but also profound uncertainty. The departure of Belgian colonial rulers left a power vacuum, and the newly independent nation descended into chaos. Patrice Lumumba, who had emerged as the leader of the independence movement, was appointed prime minister, while Joseph Kasavumbu became president. Mobutu, now in his early 30s, was appointed chief of staff of the army, an immensely powerful position at a time when Congo's military was one of the few institutions capable of maintaining order. Lumumba's rise to power coincided with the peak of Cold War tensions, as Western powers, particularly the United States and Belgium, feared that Congo could fall under Soviet influence. Lumumba's rhetoric and alliance with the Soviet Union alarmed these powers, who began searching for a Congolese ally to counterbalance Lumumba. Mobutu seized this opportunity, presenting himself as a pragmatic, anti-communist figure willing to cooperate with Western interests. In September 1960, Mobutu orchestrated a coup against Lumumba, exploiting political divisions between Lumumba and President Kasavubu. Lumumba was arrested, and Mobutu consolidated his control over the military. Lumumba's eventual assassination in January 1961 was a dark and defining moment in Congo's history. Although Mobutu publicly denied involvement, evidence suggests that he played a central role, collaborating with Western powers and Congolese political factions to eliminate Lumumba. Over the next few years, Mobutu steadily expanded his influence, carefully navigating Congo's political instability. On November 24, 1964, he seized power through a bloodless coup, overthrowing Kasavubu and declaring himself the sole leader of the country. At just 35 years old, Mobutu became head of state, ushering in a regime that would span over 3 decades and leave an indelible mark on Congo's history. The Mobutu regime. Mobutu's early years in power were marked by promises of stability and national unity. He introduced a campaign of Africanization aimed at promoting cultural pride and distancing the country from its colonial past. In 1971, he renamed the country Zaire and insisted that citizens adopt African names, banning Western names as symbols of colonial oppression. He himself adopted the name Mobutu Sese Seko, Kuku Ngabendu wa Zabanga, which roughly translates to the all-powerful warrior who goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. Mobutu also mandated that all men wear a bakos, a traditional suit that replaced Western-style jackets and ties. However, beneath the veneer of cultural pride and nationalism, Mobutu ruled Zaire with an iron fist. His regime became synonymous with corruption, brutality, and self-enrichment. Mobutu established a personality cult, plastering his image across the country and forcing citizens to chant slogans praising him. Dissent was not tolerated. Political opponents, journalists, and activists were routinely arrested, tortured, and even killed. Fear and intimidation became tools of governance, ensuring Mobutu's grip on power. Zaire's immense natural wealth, including copper, diamonds, and gold, should have made the country one of Africa's most prosperous nations. Instead, Mobutu siphoned off billions of dollars, funneling the country's resources into his own pockets. By the 1980s, Mobutu's personal fortune was estimated at $5 billion, while Zaire's infrastructure crumbled and its people sank into poverty. Hospitals, schools, and roads fell into disrepair, and basic services became inaccessible for most citizens. Despite his oppressive rule, Mobutu remained a key ally of the United States and other Western powers during the Cold War. Seen as a bulwark against communism, he received military aid and financial support, which allowed him to maintain power despite widespread discontent. Scandals and atrocities. Mobutu Sese Seko's regime is infamous for its unparalleled brutality and corruption, which left a trail of devastation across Zaire, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. His security forces were central to the machinery of terror, orchestrating countless massacres to silence opposition and maintain an iron grip on power. These atrocities were particularly gruesome in regions where dissent gained traction, such as during the Kisangani Rebellion. In this harrowing episode, hundreds of innocent civilians, including women and children, were systematically slaughtered by Mobutu's forces. Survivors recount villages set ablaze, indiscriminate shootings, and bodies left to rot as a chilling warning to others who dared resist. Entire communities were reduced to ruins, and any spark of rebellion was extinguished with overwhelming and ruthless violence. Beyond these mass killings, Mobutu's regime was characterized by a culture of fear, where political opponents were hunted down relentlessly. Those accused of opposing his rule often faced torture of the most barbaric kind, enduring excruciating physical and psychological abuse in clandestine detention centers. Public executions were staged as spectacles to instill terror among the population, with victims paraded before horrified crowds before being summarily executed. These gruesome displays served as a chilling reminder that dissent under Mobutu was a death sentence. While Mobutu's reign of terror devastated the lives of millions, his personal life stood in stark contrast, marked by unstrained opulence and decadence. Despite presiding over a nation plagued by crippling poverty and economic collapse, Mobutu indulged in a lifestyle of grotesque extravagance. One of the most glaring symbols of his excess was the infamous Gadolite Palace, often referred to as the Versailles of the jungle. This sprawling complex, hidden deep within the Congolese rainforest, was a surreal blend of wealth and mismanagement. The palace boasted glittering marble floors, gold-plated fixtures, and sprawling gardens that rivaled the estates of European royalty. Mobutu ensured that even the most remote corners of his luxurious compound were designed to exude grandeur, including private airstrips to accommodate the fleet of jets he used for international shopping sprees. The palace, estimated to have cost millions of dollars, stood as a grotesque monument to Mobutu's self-indulgence, while his people struggled to access basic necessities like food, clean water, and health care. Mobutu's disregard for his suffering populace was further underscored by his family's lavish lifestyle, which was funded by the country's depleted treasury. His children and relatives became notorious for their extravagant habits, spending millions on designer clothing, luxury cars, and exclusive holidays. Mobutu himself owned several villas and mansions across Europe, where he would retreat for periods of leisure, often accompanied by an entourage of advisors, aides, and servants. During these trips, his family would embark on extravagant shopping sprees, purchasing everything from custom-made furniture to priceless artworks. All the while, Zaire's economy crumbled under the weight of corruption, mismanagement, and crushing debt. Mobutu's insatiable greed extended to embezzling billions of dollars in state funds, stashing the money in secret foreign bank accounts. By the 1980s, he was estimated to have siphoned off over $5 billion, a staggering amount that could have transformed the lives of his impoverished citizens. The juxtaposition of Mobutu's tyranny and his flamboyant lifestyle painted a stark picture of a ruler utterly detached from the reality of his people's suffering. His regime left a legacy of pain, fear, and economic devastation, with scars that continue to shape the Democratic Republic of the Congo to this day. Mobutu's reign serves as a cautionary tale of unchecked power and the catastrophic consequences of corruption and authoritarianism on a nation's people and future. Fall from power. By the 1990s, Mobutu Sese Seko's once unshakable grip on Zaire began to crumble under the weight of internal discontent and shifting international dynamics. For decades, Mobutu had skillfully exploited the Cold War, positioning himself as a bulwark against communism in Africa and securing substantial support from Western nations, particularly the United States. However, the geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically with the end of the Cold War in 1991. Without the looming specter of Soviet influence in Africa, Western powers no longer saw Mobutu's regime as strategically essential. This loss of international patronage exposed his regime's fragility and marked the beginning of his downfall. At the same time, Zaire's economy, which had long been ravaged by rampant corruption, mismanagement, and Mobutu's unchecked kleptocracy, collapsed into near total ruin. Hyperinflation rendered the local currency worthless, infrastructure deteriorated to the point of dysfunction, and the basic services such as education and healthcare became virtually non-existent. These dire economic conditions fueled widespread public discontent, as millions of Zaireans found themselves trapped in grinding poverty with little hope for change. The situation was further exacerbated by the devastating regional impact of the 1994 Rwanda genocide, which destabilized much of Central Africa. In the aftermath of the genocide, hundreds of thousands of Hutu refugees, including members of the genocidal Interahamwe militia, flooded into eastern Zaire. This massive influx of people not only created a humanitarian crisis, but also turned the region into a volatile hotspot of ethnic tension and armed conflict. The presence of the Hutu militia in Zaire, who used the area as a base to launch an attack into Rwanda, drew the ear of the Rwandan government. This instability exposed the glaring weakness of Mobutu's regime, particularly its inability to exert control over the country's vast territory or address the growing chaos in the east. The region descended into a state of lawlessness, with various armed groups vying for control, further eroding the legitimacy of Mobutu's government. In 1996, the mounting chaos reached a tipping point when a coalition of rebel forces led by Laurent Desire Kabila and backed by Rwandan and Ugandan launched a well-coordinated offensive against Mobutu's regime. Kabila's Alliance of Democratic Forces for Liberation of Congo Zaire, AFDL, quickly gained momentum, capitalizing on widespread resentment against Mobutu's corrupt rule and the Zairean military's chronic dysfunction. Years of neglect, underfunding, and corruption had left the military ill-equipped and demoralized, rendering it incapable of mounting a serious defense. As Kabila's forces advanced across the country, they encountered little resistance, with many Zaire soldiers either defecting to the rebels or abandoning their posts altogether. The rebellion gained popular support in many areas as ordinary citizens, desperate for change, welcomed the rebels as liberators. By early 1997, it was clear that Mobutu's regime was on the brink of collapse. The international community, which had once propped up his dictatorship, now distanced itself from him. Even his longtime allies in the West declined to intervene on his behalf, seeing him as a spent force and a liability. Facing mounting pressure, Mobutu attempted to negotiate a power-sharing agreement with Kabila, but these efforts proved futile. Kabila, emboldened by his rapid military success and unwavering support from Rwanda and Uganda, refused to compromise. As the rebels closed in on the capital, Kinshasa, Mobutu's situation grew increasingly desperate. On May 16, 1997, Kabila's forces entered Kinshasa and opposed, effectively sealing Mobutu's fate. With no options left, Mobutu fled Zaire aboard his private jet, seeking refuge in Morocco. It was a humiliating end for a man who had once styled himself as the father of the nation and ruled with near absolute authority for over 3 decades. Stripped of his power and isolated from the country he had dominated for so long, Mobutu spent his final days in exile, grappling with the legacy of his tumultuous reign. On September 7, 1997, just a month after his ouster, Mobutu died of prostate cancer in Rabat, Morocco. His death marked the end of an era for Zaire, but the scars of his rule and the challenges he left behind would continue to shape the Democratic Republic of Congo for years to come. His fall remains a cautionary tale of how unchecked corruption, authoritarianism, and reliance on external powers can lead to the eventual collapse of even the most entrenched regimes. Legacy. Mobutu Sese Seko legacy remains one of the most controversial and destructive in African history, characterized by corruption, authoritarianism, and the wholesale exploitation of his nation's resources for personal gain. Although Mobutu initially presented himself as a unifier and modernizer with grand ambitions to transform Zaire into a prosperous and self-reliant African state, the reality of his 32-year rule was a stark departure from his vision. His regime became a global symbol of kleptocracy, with Mobutu himself embodying the dangers of unchecked power. From the moment he consolidated control in 1965, Mobutu built a state apparatus centered entirely on his personality and authority. He encouraged a culture of patronage and loyalty to himself, siphoning billions of dollars from the state coffers while leaving his people marred in poverty and economic despair. Estimates suggest that Mobutu personally embezzled up to $5 billion during his rule, a staggering sum that could have transformed Zaire's infrastructure and public service. Instead, the country descended into economic devastation, with collapsing institutions, rampant inflation, and widespread unemployment. One of the most enduring aspects of Mobutu's legacy is the corruption he institutionalized, which became a hallmark of his governance. Under his rule, public officials at every level of governance were encouraged to exploit their positions for personal enrichment, as long as they demonstrated unwavering loyalty to Mobutu. This practice eroded trust in state institutions and created a legacy of endemic corruption that continues to plague the Democratic Republic of Congo today. Mobutu's policy of kleptocratic authoritarianism not only impoverished the country but also deeply damaged its social fabric, leaving many citizens disillusioned with the concept of governance altogether. The infrastructure he inherited at the start of his presidency crumbled under years of neglect, and his failure to invest in education, healthcare, and development left Zaire ill-equipped to recover even after his departure. Despite his failings, Mobutu styled himself as a champion of African nationalism, coining slogans such as authenticité to promote a sense of cultural pride and unity. He mandated the adoption of African names and attires banning European influences in public life. While these policies were intended to foster a sense of national identity, they were largely superficial and failed to address the deeper structural inequalities and ethnic division within Zaire. Moreover, Mobutu's efforts at nation building were undermined by his authoritarian tendencies. Political opposition was ruthlessly suppressed, with the dissenters often imprisoned, tortured, or executed. His heavy-handed rule rifled the growth of civil society and democratic institutions, ensuring that his departure from power would leave a leadership vacuum and political instability. On the global stage, Mobutu's legacy is a cautionary tale about the complexities of Cold War-era geopolitics. For decades, Western powers, particularly the United States and France, supported Mobutu as a bulwark against communism in Africa, turning a blind eye to his abuse and corruption. This tacit endorsement enabled Mobutu to rule with impunity, even as his policies wreaked havoc on his people. However, the end of the Cold War exposed his vulnerabilities, and the withdrawal of international support hastened his downfall. The legacy of this foreign complicity continues to be debated, with many viewing it as a betrayal of the principle of human rights and democracy. Even after his overthrow in 1997, the scars of Mobutu's rule remain visible in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The years of corruption, mismanagement, and neglect created a foundation of instability that subsequent leaders have struggled to address. His name has become synonymous with dictatorship and greed, serving as a powerful reminder of the dangers of absolute power and the devastating consequences of prioritizing personal enrichment over public welfare. Today, Mobutu's legacy is remembered with a mix of anger and regret by the Congolese people, who continue to grapple with the long-term impact of his reign. Although his lavish lifestyle and grandiose rhetoric once captivated the world, his true legacy is one of suffering, division, and lost potential. Cultural and historical depictions of Mobutu, such as in films, literature, and political discourse, often highlighting his extravagant excesses and authoritarianism, cementing his place as one of Africa's most infamous leaders. In the end, Mobutu Sese Seko's rule serves as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked power, the perils of corruption, and the heavy toll that failed leadership can exact on a nation. While his regime is long gone, the consequences of his actions continue to reverberate, shaping the challenges and struggles of the modern Democratic Republic of Congo.